The wind carried dust and whispers through the empty street. Every door was shut, every curtain drawn. They'd come looking for blood. 6 armed men with the rage of their dead leader burning in their eyes. But the quiet stranger in the middle of the road, he didn't move, didn't speak. Only his shadow twitched in the dying light. And in that stillness, the town knew someone wasn't leaving alive. The sun hung low, bleeding its last light across the warped facades of Cedar Hollow. The air tasted of grit, dry and bitter, as if the whole world was holding its breath. A faded sign swung on rusted hinges above the general store, creaking with every gust, the only sound that dared to break the silence. From behind shuttered windows, slivers of pale eyes watched the lone figure standing at the heart of the street. His coat was dusty, travel-worn, the color of dead earth. His hat sat low over his brow, casting his face in shadow, yet there was a stillness about him that carried more weight than a shouted challenge. He had arrived only hours earlier, unnoticed by most at first. A stranger among strangers, just another drifter crossing through a place that didn't welcome company. He had walked the length of the main road without hurry, boots clicking softly against the warped boards of the walkway. At the saloon, he'd pushed through the swinging doors, ordered water instead of whiskey, and sat in the corner where the light didn't reach. His eyes moved slowly, measuring the room, though they never lingered on anyone long enough to make them bristle. A few had noticed the way he carried himself, not like a man with nowhere to be, but like a man who knew exactly where he was. The bartender had said nothing, though he caught the stranger watching the mirror behind the bar more than his drink. A young boy, no more than 12, had slipped inside to sell kindling to the cook, and had stopped dead in his tracks when the man glanced his way. Not a threatening look, not even sharp, just the kind that made the boy feel as though he'd been weighed and understood in an instant. That was before the pounding of hooves cracked the stillness wide open. They came from the east, the dying sun at their backs, shadows stretching long like claws across the road. 6 riders, each carrying the kind of weight that made townsfolk shrink away without being told. Dust rose behind them in a choking cloud, their horses lathered and restless. The Crow Knives. Everyone knew the name. Blackthorn had led them, Blackthorn, who'd left more graves than memories in his wake. But Blackthorn was dead now, and the brother he'd left behind was wearing a face carved from rage. Windows shuttered faster than the riders could pass. Doors locked. Mothers pulled children back from cracks in the curtains. The street emptied in seconds until only the stranger stood there, still as a post in the middle of the road. The riders reined in hard, hooves tearing at the dirt. The one in front, thick-shouldered with a scar splitting his chin, leaned forward in the saddle. "Which one of you bastards killed Blackthorn?" he shouted to no one in particular, though his gaze quickly found the stranger, who hadn't moved an inch. The stranger didn't answer. The wind tugged at the hem of his coat, lifted the brim of his hat just enough to catch a glint of his eyes. It was nothing more than a flicker, but it made the scarred man stiffen. The second rider to his left, a wiry man with a mean smile, pointed his revolver at the stranger. "You deaf, friend? We asked a question. Folks say a man passed through these parts not 2 days back, quiet, but quick on the draw. You fit the tale." No answer, only the slow lift of the stranger's head, eyes steady, unblinking. Somewhere behind the closed doors of the saloon, a bottle clinked against a glass. In the upper window of the boarding house, a hand drew the curtain back, just far enough to watch. The whole town seemed to be holding its voice, straining to see who would speak first. The leader's jaw tightened. "Maybe it was you. Maybe you think killing my brother means you're some kind of ghost story. But you're going to tell me, right here, how he died." Still, the stranger said nothing. His hands hung loose by his sides, thumbs brushing the worn leather of his gun belt, but they didn't twitch. The silence stretched, pulled tighter with each passing second, until it seemed ready to snap. The wiry outlaw spat into the dirt. "I don't like the way he's staring," he muttered. The leader's voice turned to gravel. "You think keeping quiet's gonna save you? You think we won't spill your blood right here?" The stranger's gaze drifted past them, to something far away, or maybe to a memory only he could see. Then his eyes came back, steady as stone. The corner of his mouth twitched, not into a smile, but into something colder. It was that look that made the youngest of the gang, riding at the rear, shift uncomfortably in his saddle. He'd seen men stare death in the face before, but never like this, never without fear. The leader's patience broke. He lifted his revolver, sighting down at the stranger's chest. "Last chance. Tell me who put my brother in the ground." The wind rattled a loose shutter, and the smell of dust thickened in the air. The stranger's voice, when it finally came, was low and steady, as if he were speaking more to the wind than the men in front of him. "If you knew who killed him," he said, "you wouldn't be standing so close." A ripple of unease passed through the riders, though no one moved. Somewhere in that moment, a hawk cried high above the rooftops, the sound sharp enough to pierce the tension. The leader narrowed his eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" The stranger didn't answer. He simply shifted his weight, the smallest adjustment, yet it felt like a stone dropped into still water. Somewhere deep inside each of the men facing him, something whispered that they'd made a mistake. The youngest outlaw swallowed hard, his finger tightening on the reins. The wiry one muttered under his breath, "Ain't right, this ain't right." The town remained locked in silence, every breath trapped behind wood and glass. Only the dust dared to move, swirling lazily around the boots of the man who had yet to draw his gun. Far away, beyond the canyon, the sun dipped lower, and the shadows of the crow knives stretched longer, like the reach of something inevitable. That morning, Cedar Hollow had been just another tired frontier town waking beneath the pale stretch of dawn. The air was cool, the dust settled, and the street was quiet enough that the creak of a store door seemed loud. A single rider appeared at the edge of the horizon, his shape wavering in the shimmer of heat beginning to rise from the earth. His horse moved at a steady walk, neither hurried nor slow, and the man in the saddle sat upright, with a stillness that looked more like control than comfort. He passed the blacksmith's without a glance, the metallic clang echoing faintly behind him. A pair of dogs barked at his heels before slinking away, tails low, as though sensing something they couldn't name. When he reached the saloon, he swung down from the saddle with deliberate ease, looping the reins loosely over the hitching post. His boots made no sound on the porch boards until he pushed through the swinging doors and stepped into the dim interior. The smell of whiskey and smoke clung to the air. A card game was dying in the corner, the players slouched and frowning, while a woman in a fading red dress leaned against the bar, eyes half closed. The stranger didn't make a show of himself. He moved to a table in the shadowed corner, his back to the wall, the way a man sits when he's had reason to learn caution. When the bartender wandered over, wiping a glass with a rag, the stranger asked only for water. His voice was low, even, and carried no hint of where he'd come from. He drank slowly, but his eyes were busy. They moved from the mirror behind the bar to the creak of the stairs where a man descended, to the half-shuttered window that looked out onto the street. Not in a restless way, but in measured beats, like a man counting the rhythm of a clock. It wasn't long before the talk began again, quiet at first, then swelling with each drink poured. "You hear what they found out past Bone Canyon?" One man at the bar murmured. "Body," another replied. "Blackthorn himself. Face down in the dust, 3 holes in him." The name cut through the room, like a dropped plate. Blackthorn, a man whose shadow had stretched across the territory for years, leader of the Crow Knives, feared for both his skill and his cruelty. He'd gutted men for debts less than a whiskey bill, and burned a ranch because the owner looked at him too long. Some said he'd been killed by a rival gang. Others whispered about a bounty hunter who'd been trailing him for months. But a few leaned closer, speaking as if the walls themselves might overhear. Might have been someone from his past, someone he wronged a long time ago. The stranger kept drinking, his face unreadable. Outside, the day moved on, hot and slow. A wagon creaked down the street, one wheel wobbling badly. The stranger stepped out of a saloon just as a boy of 12 was wrestling with the broken wheel, sweat on his brow and frustration in his eyes. Without a word, the man crouched beside him, examining the warped spoke. His hands were steady, sure. He loosened the bolt with a quick twist and reset the spoke into place, tapping it firm. The boy stared at him with a kind of awe. "Thanks, mister," the boy said softly. The stranger gave only a nod before standing and brushing the dust from his coat. His horse waited patiently where he'd left it, and for a moment it looked as if he'd mount up and ride on. But he stayed, drifting back toward the saloon's shade. By then the stories had grown wilder. A drunk at the bar, red-faced and swaying, squinted at the stranger. "I've seen you before," he slurred. "A long way from here. Can't place it, but I swear it." The stranger didn't acknowledge him, though the faintest crease formed between his brows. The drunk grinned to himself as if he discovered a private joke, then went back to his drink. The heat deepened, the kind that made the air hum. Flies gathered near the horse trough. Somewhere down the street, a shutter slammed against a wall. The town seemed to sink into that slow rhythm of waiting for the day to end. Then, faint at first, came the sound. Hooves, distant, muffled, like a storm still far away. But they grew louder, sharper, until the boards beneath the porch seemed to tremble. People looked up from their work, eyes narrowing. Conversations died mid-sentence. A woman pulled her child inside, the door shutting quick behind them. The stranger's hand brushed the brim of his hat, tilting it lower, shadowing his face. His gaze followed the dust cloud rising at the far end of the street. 6 riders emerged, the sun behind them, the dust boiling at their heels. Their approach was not hurried. It was the kind of pace men used when they knew the whole town would wait for them. The saloon doors swung shut behind the stranger as he stepped out fully into the light. The 6 riders fanned out as they reached the middle of the street, their horses sidestepping, nostrils flaring at the scent of tension in the air. Dust curled around them, catching the last light of day, turning the scene into a haze of gold and shadow. The stranger stood in the center, boots planted, coat brushing his legs with the wind. He didn't flinch when the horses closed in, their riders forming a half-circle that cut him off from either end of the street. At their head sat a broad-shouldered man, his dark hair matted from the ride, his eyes a shade too familiar to anyone who'd ever crossed paths with Blackthorn. This was the brother, younger by years, but with a face that had already learned the same hardness. A revolver hung low at his hip, but his hand rested on it in a way that made it clear it could be drawn in the space between 2 breaths. "You," he said, his voice like a rock dragged across gravel. "You fit the description. Tall, quiet, rides alone. I've been hearing about a man like you since Drabone Canyon. Tell me now straight, before I lose my patience. Were you the one who put Blackthorn in the ground?" The stranger's head tilted slightly, a movement so small it could have been mistaken for a shrug. His voice, when it came, was calm enough to cut through the wind without needing volume. "If you knew who killed him," he said, "you wouldn't be standing so close." A murmur ran through the riders, quick and low, like a rattle before the strike. The younger ones tightened their grips on the reins, uncertain whether the words were a warning or an insult. The leader's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't draw, not yet. "Big talk for a man alone," the wiry outlaw to his left said, his grin showing too much tooth. "You think you scare us with riddles?" The stranger didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on the leader, and without seeming to move with urgency, he shifted a half-step sideways. To most it would have seemed meaningless, but it placed his body squarely between the riders and a young woman crouched behind a barrel at the edge of the street. Her hands were clenched to her chest, eyes wide, watching the scene unfold. The leader noticed the move, and the faintest flicker of something passed over his face. "Trying to play protector now," he said. "Makes me think you've got something to hide. Maybe her. Maybe the truth." The stranger's gaze didn't waver. "Truth's a funny thing," he said softly. "It can kill a man faster than a bullet." The wiry outlaw spat into the dirt. "Only if you're fool enough to believe it." The leader's patience thinned. "I'll make this simple," he said, shifting in the saddle. "One chance to tell me how my brother died. You say the wrong thing, or nothing at all, and I'll send you to keep him company." The street had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, holding its breath. From the boarding house window, a child's face peeked between the curtains. The stranger could feel every set of eyes on him, every pulse in the air. His reply came slow, deliberate, like a man measuring each word before he set it down. "Some men die from the bullet," he said. "Others from the truth." The wiry one barked a humorless laugh. "He's toying with us." The leader leaned forward, his hand brushing the grip of his gun. "You think you're clever, stranger?" "No," the man in the road said, his voice even. "I think you're standing in a place you don't understand." That was enough to pull a sneer from the younger brother's lips. "Then maybe I'll change the view for you." He shifted, as though to draw, and the riders' horses danced sideways, ears flicking at the sudden tension. The woman behind the barrel pressed herself lower, her breath quick and shallow. The stranger's hand hovered near his holster, but he didn't make the first move. Instead, he let the silence stretch again, taut as wire, daring them to be the ones to cut it. Around them, the town held steady in its hiding places, every man and woman knowing that one twitch of a finger could tear the afternoon apart. The stranger's shadow stretched long toward the gang, and for a heartbeat, no one breathed. The moment cracked open with the smallest movement, a twitch from the wiry outlaw's trigger finger. It was enough. The world erupted. The first shot split the air like a whip crack, loud enough to jar the silence from every hidden corner of town. Muzzle flash lit the dusty street in a burst of orange, smoke blooming instantly around the riders. Horses screamed and jerked sideways, iron shoes tearing at the packed dirt. The stranger's hand moved almost lazily, yet his revolver cleared leather before most men would have even thought to draw. The first outlaw dropped where he sat, his hat tumbling from his head as he pitched sideways into the dirt. The second barely had time to lift his rifle before a round slammed into his chest, jerking him backward over the saddle. The stranger didn't fire wildly. Every pull of the trigger was measured, precise. The air filled with the deafening rhythm of gunfire, each report echoing off the false front buildings. Windows shattered. A bullet chewed splinters from the post beside the stranger, another whining past his ear close enough to make the hair shift at his temple. Still, he didn't flinch. A third outlaw lunged from the side, trying to circle for an angle. The stranger's arm swept in a smooth arc, his revolver spitting flame. The man went down hard, his boots kicking up a spray of dust before going still. By the time the smoke began to settle, half the gang lay scattered on the street. The survivors cursed and hauled themselves into cover behind an abandoned wagon, their horses snorting and rolling their eyes in panic. One fired blindly over the edge, the shot shattering the window of the mercantile. The townsfolk began to stir, drawn to the gunfight despite themselves. A man in a work apron ducked low behind a barrel, peering out in disbelief. From the saloon, the bartender leaned against the doorway, his face pale. Whispers rippled between those who dared to watch. The stranger stepped sideways into the lee of a watering trough, crouching just enough to reload. He worked with an unhurried precision, each cartridge clicking home as if he were assembling a ritual. Smoke curled around his hat brim. His breathing stayed even, almost slow, as though the chaos had no claim on him. From behind the wagon, a voice rose, ragged with pain. "You're him." A pause, followed by a wet cough. "You're the one from the canyon." No answer came. The stranger slid the last round into the cylinder, spun it once, and thumbed it closed. His boots ground in the dirt as he rose again, stepping into the open without hesitation. One outlaw broke, bolting for his horse. The stranger's gun barked once, and the man crumpled before he reached the saddle. Another tried to flank him from the far side, but the shot that found him was as inevitable as the sun setting in the west. The wagon no longer offered safety. The remaining men knew it. They stumbled back, firing a last desperate volley before retreating down the street, their shouts fading into the distance. The wind returned then, lifting the haze of gunpowder and grit. The stranger stood alone in the center of the street, revolver lowered but still in his hand, his silhouette framed by the drifting dust. All around him lay the still forms of the fallen. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire had been. Somewhere a door creaked open. A woman stepped onto a porch, her gaze fixed on him. Behind her, others emerged, moving slowly as if afraid the scene might break apart if they disturbed it too soon. The young boy he'd helped that morning stood in the road shadow, eyes wide with something between fear and awe. The stranger holstered his revolver, the leather swallowing the weight of it without a sound. Then he turned his head toward the wounded man behind the wagon. The outlaw's hand was pressed to his side, blood seeping fast through his fingers, his eyes glassy, but locked on the man who'd just dismantled half his crew. "You're him," the outlaw said again, voice breaking. "From Drabome Canyon, you're the ghost." The stranger gave him nothing, no confirmation, no denial. Only the quiet click of metal as he checked the revolver's cylinder one last time before snapping it shut. The motion was slow, deliberate, as if time itself had given him permission to take it. Then, without a word, he stepped past the bodies and kept walking, leaving the dust to settle over everything that had just happened. Years before Cedar Hollow, before the dust and the whispers, he had worn a badge. The star had been plain, unpolished, not the shining kind that men wore for show. He'd pinned it to his chest each morning with the quiet certainty of someone who believed in the weight of the law. That was before Blackthorn. It had been a winter that never seemed to end. Snow crusted the hills outside Abilene, and the wind cut through cloth and skin alike. He'd been away on a marshal's errand when Blackthorn's gang rode into his home. By the time word reached him, the trail was cold and his house was ash. His wife and young daughter lay in the ruins, taken not by accident but by choice, Blackthorn's choice. He buried them without ceremony, the frozen ground biting at the spade until his hands bled. The badge lay heavy in his pocket the whole time. He didn't put it back on after that. When the last stone was laid, he walked away from the grave and from the life that had no place for him anymore. From then on, the hunt was his only work. He didn't chase bounty posters or serve warrants. He chased the Crow knives, following them from town to town, canyon to canyon, like a shadow that couldn't be shaken. Sometimes he caught sight of Blackthorn himself, once on a ridge, once in the reflection of a saloon mirror, but each time the distance was too great. It was in Drabome Canyon that the chase ended. The sky there was the color of rust, and the wind never stopped moaning through the rocks. He'd waited 2 days in the heat, watching the narrow pass where Blackthorn's men would come through with their spoils from a raid. When they appeared, he didn't fire right away. He waited until Blackthorn was at the head, his grin white against the dirt on his face. The fight was short, but it was no clean arrest. Bullets bit into the canyon walls, dust rising like smoke. The men fell one by one until only Blackthorn remained, bleeding from the shoulder, but still trying to raise his gun. The stranger closed the distance, each step slow enough for Blackthorn to understand that the moment had finally come. They said Blackthorn feared nothing, but in those last seconds, there was fear in his eyes. Not for his own life. Men like him rarely clung to it, but for the brother he'd left behind. "Leave him," Blackthorn rasped, blood on his lips. "He's not me. Don't hunt him." The stranger didn't answer. When it was done, there were no witnesses, no deputies to record the kill. Just the wind, the empty canyon, and the bodies cooling in the dust. He left them there, the sun already working to erase the scene. By nightfall, he was riding away, the weight of justice done heavy in his chest and hollow at the same time. He hadn't spoken Blackthorn's name again. Not to lawmen, not to barkeepers, not to himself. The hunt was over, or so he thought. Now, in Cedar Hollow, the brother stood before him without knowing the truth he was stepping into. The fight had left the street littered with bodies, and only one outlaw still breathed. A man clutching a wound in his side, eyes locked on the stranger as though he could see the whole story written there. The stranger walked to him slowly, boots crunching over grit. He crouched, the shadow of his hat falling across the wounded man's face. "Your leader begged before the end," he said quietly, his voice almost drowned by the whisper of the wind. "Not for his life, but for yours." The outlaw's breath caught, a shiver passing through him despite the heat. His gaze flicked toward the horizon, as though searching for the brother who would never ride back to save him. The stranger straightened, the memory of the canyon still burning behind his eyes, and turned away without another word. The street lay still, the echoes of gunfire already sinking into the dust. Smoke curled from shattered windows, the scent of spent powder and sun-baked earth mingling in the dry air. The bodies of the gang sprawled where they'd fallen, their shadows growing longer in the late afternoon light. Those who'd managed to flee were nothing but fading silhouettes on the horizon, riding hard for nowhere that would keep them safe. A deputy hurried toward the stranger, a leather pouch heavy with coin in his hand. "Town's grateful," he said, his voice carrying the nervous relief of a man who'd lived through something he shouldn't have. "This here's yours. Reward from the people." The stranger didn't reach for it. His eyes stayed on the dust at his feet, the same way a man might watch the ground over a grave. "I'm not owed," he said simply, voice low but firm. "At least give us your name." The deputy pressed, as if recording it might anchor the moment, give it a place in the town's history. The stranger adjusted the brim of his hat, shadowing his face. "Names just get carved on stones," he said. Then he turned and walked toward the hitching post, where his horse waited, muscles twitching beneath a coat the color of storm clouds. From the doorway of the saloon, the boy he'd saved earlier stepped out. He couldn't have been more than 12, but the dust on his face and the way he stood said he'd seen too much for his age. He trotted after the stranger, boots scuffing the packed dirt, a mix of awe and uncertainty in his voice. "Mister," the boy called, "they say you were a lawman once. They say you've hunted men clear across the territories. They say you—" The stranger stopped, glancing back just enough for the boy to see one eye beneath the shadow of his hat. "The truth's heavier than the legend, son," he said. "Carry one, not both." The boy frowned, the words sinking in like slow rain into dry ground. He wanted to ask more, about the gang, about the stranger's past, but something in the man's tone told him the questions would find no answers. The stranger swung into the saddle, the leather creaking under his weight. He gave the reins a gentle pull, and the horse turned toward the open desert. No one tried to stop him. No one asked again for his name. The sun was dipping low, the sky washed in copper and gold. The wind rose, lifting loose dust into the air, erasing the last footprints from the fight. As he rode, the town shrank behind him, its sounds fading until only the quiet breath of the desert remained. Some men rode for the law, others for gold. But the quiet stranger? He rode for something different. Not for praise, not for vengeance, not anymore. He rode for the silence that comes when the guilty are gone, and for the space that silence leaves behind. And in that silence, his name was carried away on the wind, forgotten by all but the dust.